The honourable member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And to start, I'd like to say that I'll be splitting my time with the honourable member for Abitibi Timiskaming. Madam Speaker, the motion before this honourable House today, that government must recognise that saving lives is the top priority for Canadian Coast Guard search and rescue services, is much like the motion that was debated in this House just weeks ago. That motion called for Canada to adopt an international search and rescue readiness standard of 30 minutes at all times around the clock for the military's search and rescue Cormorant helicopters. Mr. Speaker, the response time for the Madam Speaker, the response time for the Cormorant helicopters varies depending on the time of day. Between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. Monday to Friday, the wheels-up response time for a Cormorant helicopter is 30 minutes. After 4 p.m. and on weekends and during holidays, the wheels-up response time is up to 2 hours. Needless to say, Madam Speaker, that response time has cost mariners their lives. You would never see a fire department operate that way. People would revolt because it would make no sense, because people would most surely die. People have died on the water, Madam Speaker, because of the search and rescue response time policy. In fact, according to the CBC's The Fifth Estate, there have been 9 cases in the last 8 years alone, 9 cases in 8 years where people died waiting for search and rescue that didn't come quick enough. The Conservatives voted against that motion, Madam Speaker, that called for Canada to adopt a 30-minute around-the-clock response time. Again, both that motion and the motion before this House today, right now, are about saving lives, about saving the lives of mariners, about how saving lives should be a top priority. That's the common theme, saving the lives of mariners. Why did the Conservatives vote against the motion, that motion I just spoke of, at the end of April, if lives would have been saved because of it? I'll tell you why, Madam Speaker. I have the quotes right here. This is a quote from the Parliamentary Secretary for National Defence. You just heard him a few minutes ago. Quote, "We also do not think it is the place of the House, this member, or other members to determine what the actual response times of the Canadian Forces or any other body ought to be on these matters." I'm going to repeat that quote, Madam Speaker. "We also do not think it is the place of the House, this member, or other members to determine what the actual response times of the Canadian Forces or any other body ought to be on these matters." I couldn't believe that quote when I heard it, Madam Speaker. It is not the place of this House to debate a search and rescue policy of the Canadian Forces that impacts the lives of Canadian mariners. It is not the place of this House to debate a search and rescue response policy, an inadequate search and rescue response policy that has been directly linked to the deaths of Canadian mariners. It is not the place of this House to debate a search and rescue response policy that the Conservative government is reluctant to change because of the associated cost. How much is a life worth, Madam Speaker? Can the Conservatives give us a cost breakdown? Is that in the Conservative action plan? I say it is our place, Madam Speaker. It is our place to stand up for Canadians who cannot stand up for themselves, to stand up for any injustice, on land or on water. It is our place to stand up when a policy falls short of protecting the Canadians it was instituted to protect. It is our place. It is our place. So here we are today, debating another motion that the government must recognize that saving lives is the top priority for Canadian Coast Guard search and rescue services. I can't believe we're actually debating this, Madam Speaker. How the Conservatives can stand up and argue this is beyond me. The next part of the motion before us today reads that local service and knowledge, as well as the ability to communicate in the language of the communities served, are essential to delivering effective and timely life-saving operations. Closing the Maritime Rescue Subcentre in my riding of St. John's South Mount Pearl more specifically on the south side of St. John's Harbour, was the wrong move. It was the wrong move because those distress calls are now directed to Halifax or Trenton, Ontario. I don't know if you've noticed, Madam Speaker, but Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have unique accents. Most Canadians know that. Me, I'm not so lucky to have a full-blown Newfoundland accent, although we all sound different on the wharf. But many fishermen, many mariners aren't so easy to understand unless you're from the place. If your ship is going down and you have seconds, mere seconds to send off a mayday, I can tell you this, Madam Speaker, a mainlander would have a hard time understanding a person from Outport, Newfoundland and Labrador, who's also probably overexcited, facing a life or death situation. I can tell you this too, Madam Speaker. A mainlander would have a hard time pinpointing the various locations around Newfoundland and Labrador on a map. There are countless seal coves. There are countless Bell Islands. So local service and knowledge and the ability to communicate in the language of the communities served is essential. It's more than essential. It's critical. It's more than critical, Madam Speaker. It's a matter of life and death. It was bad enough the Conservatives closed the Maritime Rescue Subcentre in my riding, directing distress calls again to Halifax and Trenton, Ontario. How did the Conservatives next fail our mariners? I'll give you an example, an unbelievable example, Madam Speaker. Medical calls for help from ships off Newfoundland and Labrador, and only off Newfoundland and Labrador, were routed 5,000 miles away to Italy. That's right, Madam Speaker. The calls were being directed to a Rome-based non-profit organization that's been described as the soup kitchen of telehelp. The soup kitchen of telehelp. It was bad enough the Conservatives closed the Maritime Rescue Subcentre in my riding. Mainlanders have a hard enough time understanding my people, the people where I come from, let alone Italians. Our search and rescue response times are among the worst in the world. That's undebatable. Our mariners have died waiting for help that didn't come. So did 14-year-old Burton Winters of Makkovik, Labrador. The Conservative government has written off our fishery and now our mariners. The resentment towards this Conservative government is growing, Madam Speaker, and will continue to grow unless the Conservative government changes tack and drops its defeatist attitude towards the East Coast. The last part of today's motion, Madam Speaker, calls on the Conservative government to reverse the decision to close the Maritime Rescue Search and Rescue Coordination Centres in St. John's and Quebec City, as well as the Coast Guard station in Kinsalamo, Vancouver. Madam Speaker, I've had conversations with former employees of the Maritime Rescue Search and Rescue Coordination Centre in St. John's. I have heard these former employees say that lives will be lost. Hear me on the other side. Lives will be lost because of this Conservative government's decision. These former employees know what they're talking about. They worked on the front lines for decades at the Rescue Subcentre. These frontline employees know the coastline of Newfoundland and Labrador like the backs of their hands. These frontline employees know the dialects of Newfoundland and Labrador. Keep in mind, Madam Speaker, that accents can be different from one cove to the next cove to the next cove. These frontline employees were familiar with the hundreds of communities that dot our coastline. They knew many of the men and women who plied the waters. They knew not just the mariners, but their friends and their relatives. That local knowledge, that on-the-ground knowledge, is critical in a search and rescue situation where seconds are hours, where hours are days, and where days are, you're probably dead if it's days. Madam Speaker, I implore this government, I implore this House to vote for this motion, to vote for saving lives, to vote for making the saving of lives the top priority above saving money, above petty politics. I implore this government to reverse its decision and do the right thing. Show the mariners of Newfoundland and Labrador, show the mariners of Atlantic Canada, show Canadian mariners all over Canada that they know where their priorities are, so that, in the words of our late leader Jack Layton, no one is left behind. On land or on water, no one is left behind. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions incoming. The honourable member for St. John.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his speech tonight. And I've got to know the honourable member a little bit through the Fisheries Committee, and he certainly brings a lot of sincerity and a lot of passion to any cause that he gets behind. But, Madam Speaker, I'm going to ask him a question, or through you, Madam Speaker. I've asked other members here in the House tonight, and when it comes to the funding for the refitting and the new vessels for the Canadian Coast Guard, we know how important these are to this funding is to enable the Canadian Coast Guard to continue doing the job. And when the honourable member stands here tonight and says he implores people to vote for this motion, I would implore him to vote for the budget so that we can see that funding flow, so that those people can have the tools to do the job that he so rightly sets as a priority. Madam Speaker, will the honourable member stand up and do the right thing and vote to ensure that those people in the Canadian Coast Guard have the right tools to do the job?
The honourable member for St. John South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the honourable member opposite for the question. The honourable member opposite is from the Maritimes. He's from New Brunswick, if I'm correct. So I can't believe I'm actually going to have to say this. He's from a maritime province that's near the water. But the quickest way to get to a ship or a person in distress on the water is not by Coast Guard ship. It's by cormorant helicopter. That's the quickest way. It's by helicopter. So if you've got a 2-hour response time after 4 o'clock, on weekends and on holidays, and 30 minutes between 9 to 4, how can you say that that's okay? How can you say that? How can you stand up and argue for it? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, and I want to compliment the member on his intervention on this important issue. And I wonder if he would comment on the fact that the closure of the St. John's Rescue Centre and the Quebec City Rescue Centre, where when all three were operating, there's 6 rescue coordinators on duty. And when they're finished this government's handiwork, if they don't change their mind, there will only be 3 dealing with the entire area and all of the rescue missions that have to be taking place coordinated through one centre. Does he see that, first of all, half as many people, does he see that as causing problems as well, having everything put into one place?
The honourable member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. I also thank the honourable member for the motion that he presented before this House, that he argued before this House at the end of April, and today's motion that the honourable member presented to this House. So I thank him very much for that, because these motions are critical for all of Canada, for all our maritime provinces. In regards to his question, the answer is obviously yes. If you cut the number of personnel at these rescue sub-centres in half, from 6 to 3, and they're expected to handle the same number of calls, the same number of cases in a given number of hours, and on top of that, they got to deal with things that I mentioned in my speech, from the dialect of particular people in particular provinces on the East Coast, to the geography of the communities that dot our coastline. I think it's going to be an impossible situation. I had a conversation with a retired employee of the Rescue Subcenter in St. John's just a little while ago, and what he said was this. He said that it's a matter of time before lives are lost. It's a matter of time before lives are lost. Thank you, Madam Speaker.